Wheat Ridge residence, 6410 West 47th Avenue. And I'm a realtor by profession, some 30 plus years. I bought my first house in Wheat Ridge, 1977, and it was on West 26th Avenue, the Wheat Ridge side. I paid $32,000 for it. It went back on the market about a month ago, 2 months ago. They wanted $325,000 for it. It was about 700 square foot, and we quickly outgrew that house. What I'm here to talk about is the building defect law and how it's impeding affordable housing for not only Wheat Ridge, but the entire state. I want to pass out some handouts for you, if you would. I know you've all heard and read in the paper how critical this real estate market is. I think these graphs will really drive it home to you. At 1 o'clock today, if you would have called me and said, will you show me some homes under $300,000 in the city of Wheat Ridge, you know how many I could show you? 5. One is a townhome, one is a condo, and the other 2 are single family. And the one, the single family that was $299,000, in your printouts here, it's the 3rd page. Look at that house, 698 square feet. That's what you get for $299,000. It's very critical. We have no inventory. One of the big reasons we don't have inventory is because we quit building starter products. And Wheat Ridge is one of the areas that we need to have starter homes. So people like myself, 40 years ago, could get into a house and own a house. The young people of today are frozen out of Wheat Ridge. They can't afford it. They can't afford Arvada. They can't afford Thornton. This is a critical area, simply because we're doing great economically, but we have no starter products. And this law that they tried to amend and everything else, they couldn't do it to the state legislature. We need you. We need you as our representatives to pass some sort of an ordinance like Lakewood did and relieve these developers so they can come in and build some affordable housing. We've got to have that product. If you'll look at that first graph that I'm showing you here, what it depicts is from 2010 to 2015. That's historically the active listings. If you'll look around 2011, we had almost 8,000 listings. Today, or January of 2015, we have less than 600. This really impacts, the critical situation. The next graph, take a look at the next graph. It shows you on the left side, this is the price, under $350,000. And look at the spike. In January 2015, that goes off the charts. Unbelievable. When I put on a house in anywhere, it doesn't make any difference. I get a flurry of showings. I get multiple offers. And anything under $350, if it's not under contract in 3 days, I've overpriced it. And it's hard to overprice them.
Rocky, I'm afraid you've gone 3 minutes.
Okay. I spoke as quick as I could.
I know you did. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, Rocky.
Ms. Fisher.
Good evening. My name is Britta Fisher, and I'm a resident of District 1, and I'm here to speak tonight as a resident and citizen, and I want to make it clear that Wheat Ridge 2020 has not taken a position on what I'm about to speak to. I wanted to mention 2 things on the agenda tonight. One, I was proud to participate on the Gold Line Stakeholder Committee. Mr. Aldretti and Dr. Cog, their team did a fine job in facilitating a very good and inclusive process, and so I hope you'll consider the recommendations that they're bringing forward. One of those recommendations is for mixed and diverse housing at our transit-oriented development sites. We have one at Ward Road in the city of Wheat Ridge and Border one on the Arvada Ridge area. Due to construction defects legislation not passing this year, even despite having a very broad and diverse coalition coming together to support reform, we are still stuck without some types of housing in our housing spectrum. The type of housing that is missing is affordable for sale, and the previous speaker did a great job of alluding to some of that. Another statistic for you is that multifamily owner-occupied housing, so condos and townhomes, has dropped from 25% of our market share to only 3.9% in the Denver metro area. So it has drastically fallen, and there is very little being built, particularly in the condo category. The condos that are being built are luxury ones. They are able to have the profit margin in order to cover the risk. So what's the difference between the condos that are being built and the condos, and what is before you? Well, my understanding is that this is about a plat note that is harder to change, and a vote of an HOA cannot simply repeal it. Arbitration, which is what is promoted in this ordinance, is still a form of justice and can help reduce the cost to all involved in the transaction. A couple things from a builder in town here, Newtown Builders, Gene Myers, and I spoke, and he said for a builder like him, condos are not even an option. They simply cannot get the general liability insurance that's required for a builder of their size. They don't have the balance sheet and the profile to pull that off. There's very few that can. So with the townhome product, they still have to pay a lot because of construction defects, but there are actually tools available for him to do that through insurance, through RAP insurance and other things. So as you consider this, I know it's the beginning of the discussion. I'd be happy to be a resource to you, and I know Mr. Myers would like to be a resource as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Bob Aldridge. I'm a resident of Wheatridge. I live at 2890 Lamar. Been a resident for about 20 years now. And again, I want to speak on the construction defect issue. It's easy to talk about the fact that nobody likes construction defects. We all agree with that. The problem is how to resolve that issue, and what's in place right now is not solving the problem. These other people have alluded to the fact that we're not building any affordable housing and owner-occupied housing. A different statistic than they gave, first quarter of this year in the Denver metro area, only 1.1% of the new construction was in condos, and those were luxury condos. None of it's affordable housing. I know the city of Wheatridge a number of years ago worked real hard to reduce the percentage of renters in the city because we had over a 50% ratio of renters to owner-occupied properties. They did some great things, but then the economy turned, and not much more has happened. So I think it's most important to realize that the very people we want to help the most, affordable housing buyers, are the ones getting hurt the most. Some of the changes in the new legislation would have changed from having a majority of the board of directors agree to file a class action lawsuit to having a majority of the homeowners. Well, those are the very homeowners we're talking about. They ought to have a voice in the process. So that was one of the suggestions. The mandatory arbitration and mediation is another issue, giving the builder the opportunity to correct the defects. Again, that was in this most recent Senate Bill 177. So I would just encourage you to maybe pattern some statute over similar to the Lakewoods. I think moving forward, more and more cities are going to do this, and I would hope that you would see it that way. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, let me pass out two, these are copies of emails I sent to Sherry John and Jesse Danielson about this.
Do we have any other speakers tonight on subjects that are on the agenda? We do.
Hi, I'm Bonnie MG, and I live at 40 Morningside Drive. I've been there for 25 plus years. I'm a real estate agent. I have sold in Wheat Ridge over 20 years. I have noticed that we do not have the product anymore for the young people and for us retirees. They're getting there. We don't have the condos that we can move into and afford. I'm worried that we'll become one of those exclusionary cities that just doesn't have the product to bring the young people in, which we need. You need changes and the enthusiasm of young people, and to keep our seniors here. It's a very diverse city, and I think it's a great city, but I am worried about not doing something to get rid of this construction defects or to mitigate it. I love Wheat Ridge, and I hope that we can do something about it. Thanks.
Thank you, Bonnie. Anyone else? Okay, I think we can move on to our regular meeting program, which begins with Paul Andretti, Dr. Cog, and we're going to discuss the Sustainable Communities Initiative, which took a couple of months out of Paul's life.
I was afraid to come tonight. I thought your power might go out again. So the reason I didn't speak the last time. So, lights are on. Everything seems to be working. So we're in good shape so far. So I do want to talk to you a bit tonight about the outcomes of the Sustainable Communities Initiative. And I understand that you have the slides, although I think when we print the slides, I think even the ones that I've hidden on the slideshow pop up, so if it doesn't look exactly like what you have, please excuse me. So in 2011, Dr. Cog was awarded a $4.5 million grant from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. This is part of a program called the Sustainable Communities Program. It was a program across 3 federal agencies, the U.S. EPA, U.S. Department of Transportation, and the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development to support community planning. The first set of grants was awarded in 2010. We applied for that, did not receive one of those grants, came back, put together a much more robust program, applied in 2011, and we were awarded one of the largest of the grants. The purpose of the grants, and I promise I won't do a lot of reading to you tonight, but I will on this one, to align investments, programs, and policies to maximize the benefits that result from the region's investment in transit through collaborative planning and stakeholder engagement. So what does that mean? Basically, we have this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity with the build-out of our transit system to look at a very integrated and holistic fashion about the issues that we face as a community, and to think about how we can take advantage of that opportunity through the build-out of the transit system to not only address these issues in the transit corridors, but also in the region as a whole.
Paul, can you make sure you speak into the mic?
Oh,
so
sure.
people on TV can hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, thanks a lot. I have this camera thing. Now I'm going to be really in bad shape. So there were 5 main tasks in the SCI project: regional planning, corridor implementation, catalytic projects. And in those first 3, we started at the high level, at the regional level. We looked at the transit corridors, and then at specific sites. That's the catalytic projects, which I'll talk a little bit about in a moment. Then we also engaged our stakeholders throughout the communities. And this was a very deliberative process because quite often there are communities in our region that are not at the planning table. So we set out deliberately to bring those folks to the table and get their perspectives. And the final task was what we call the Outcomes Assessment and Knowledge Sharing, the acronym OAKS. And this was a look at the existing 3 corridors, the Southeast, Southwest, and West corridors in the region, and also transit in 3 peer communities in the West, Dallas, San Diego, and Portland. And to really look at best practices and metrics and examples about how we can learn from our past experiences here and in other regions and use that as to benefit our planning processes for the build out of the transit system. So tonight we're really going to focus on the corridor implementation because that has a very immediate impact in Wheat Ridge. As you've heard already tonight, you are in one of the transit corridors. You have the terminus station on the Gold Corridor, and you're very close to the Arvada Ridge station. So first of all, why do we do corridor planning? And the simple fact is that corridor planning allows communities to work collaboratively so that they can really leverage the opportunities in the corridor in a much greater fashion than they would if they each were working separately on this. And I like to throw, well, now I am missing a slide, sorry. Oh, there it is. So I like to throw this slide up. This is a slide that was done for the West Corridor before the build-out. So when Denver and Lakewood were looking at the build-out of the West Line, they each came out with a list of their station areas and the residential, office, and retail square footage that they anticipated they could build at each of those station areas. And so the important thing is to look at the totals here. So they anticipated if you added up all of the potential growth at every station, you'd end up with 29,000 units of housing. You'd end up with 12.5 million square feet of office space and 4.9 million square feet of retail. And I think you can probably look at those numbers and realize that really wasn't very terribly realistic. And the better way of approaching this, rather than looking at every individual station area, was to think about every station area and how it was part of a larger whole within the corridor. So you could say, okay, at 10th and Osage, what can we do there? Is that a housing area? Is that a commercial area? Maybe it doesn't make sense to put anything there except for commercial and light industrial. And so it really, in looking at the corridor as a whole, this process, this collaborative process, lets communities work together to really focus on what's going into the station areas and to make sure it's appropriate given the situation in those particular station areas. There were several components to the corridor planning effort. All of this work was done by what we called a corridor working group. And the corridor working group consisted of city staff folks. So from Wheat Ridge, we had Ken Johnson and Steve Art, who participated in our corridor working group. Their counterparts from Arvada and Denver were also on that committee, and we had important stakeholders like RTD also on that group. They undertook a full process of developing a vision and goals for the corridor. They identified a catalytic project and a technical assistance study. Now, the catalytic project was a site at one of the station areas in which we put some funding into it through the grant to do some station-specific planning. And the reason we called this a catalytic site was for two reasons. One is that we hoped that the outcome of this study would catalyze development at that particular project area. But second, that it would do so in such a way as it would serve as a model for development in other sites. The technical assistance study took an issue, or in the case of the Gold Corridor, two issues of importance to the corridor as a whole, and performed a study on those issues to provide guidance and planning moving forward. The grant put $450,000 into the catalytic project and technical assistance studies. The corridor working group decided to spend $150,000 on the catalytic project, which in this corridor was the Wheat Ridge Ward Road Station, and also an affordable housing study and a market readiness study, both of which I'll talk about in a minute. We also engaged stakeholders. Britta was on our corridor stakeholder committee. They provided input on all this work to the corridor working group, so the input of people who daily live and work and recreate in the corridor had some input and had a review over what the corridor working group was doing. And finally, the corridor working group came up with a set of recommendations, which I'll share to you tonight based on all that work that went on. So what did we do with all of that? For each corridor, we created what we called a corridor blueprint. That is the repository for all the learning that came out of this. And the reason we call it a corridor blueprint, quite simply, is that we hope that provides a blueprint for the communities to work both individually and together moving forward using all of this information. So the corridor blueprint contains corridor profiles, which were some baseline data and mapping and identification of opportunities and challenges. This was all work that was done through organization called Reconnecting America, who we brought on to do this. The corridor profile itself is about 88 pages long. We will have that up online so that you can peruse that. It includes GSI mapping, demographics, and a whole ton of other information. The blueprint contains the vision and goals that the Corridor Working Group created, the results of the catalytic and technical assistance studies, a stakeholder engagement profile that identifies who we spoke with and the issues that they brought up, and finally a set of recommendations. So what were those outcomes? So this is the vision that the Corridor Working Group came up with for the Gold Corridor. And I'm not going to read this, you've got it, but basically the purpose of this was to say, as we look forward 30, 40, 50 years in the future, what do we want the Gold Corridor to look like? And this is the vision they came up with to guide that thinking. They also came up with a set of goals. These are actions to take to achieve the vision that was identified. So you have improving connectivity, preserving and creating a range of quality housing choices. You guys are going to feel like you're getting beat up tonight on housing, but I think you get a sense of how important that is. Sustaining, expanding, attracting a diverse and unique economic base, leveraging public investments, attracting and enhancing amenities and services, providing access to the recreational opportunities, and promoting denser development near the station to both conserve resources and reduce the combined costs of transportation and housing. So the first technical assistance study that was conducted, and again, the Corridor Working Group decided what these technical assistance studies should be, allocated the funding. They actually reviewed all of the proposals that were put out there, and although that Dr.Cog was the financial manager of these projects, the oversight of the actual work was conducted by the Corridor Working Group, since they were the people, you are the people, and they are your representatives who are going to benefit from this work. So I'm going to go through this one probably more in more depth than I will on the market readiness study, only because this issue of housing has come up so much this evening. The affordable housing, there were really three important outcomes. One, you already have a deficit of affordable housing in the Gold Corridor. Two, the situation is changing incredibly fast. Land prices are going up so quickly that the ability to acquire land to build affordable housing, you're losing that opportunity really quickly. And the third is that this is just going to get worse over time. So you can read those reports. This is also available online to get into that more. And I think if you would like a briefing just on this piece of the technical assistance study, Steve and Ken can certainly arrange that. The second study that we did, I'm sorry, I started out with affordable housing, and I have the market readiness study. That tells you how affordable housing is top on my mind. We did this, the second study that we did was this market readiness study. And what this was really about, actually you were the second corridor that did this. The East Corridor also did a market readiness study. Their study really looked at job growth. The focus of this study not only included job growth, but looked at amenities and how you include those amenities to station areas so that they catalyze economic development in those station areas. So there were a bunch of results from this. Again, you can take a look at this in more depth, or if you would like, I'll answer some questions at the end of it. As I told you earlier, the catalytic project was the Wheat Ridge Ward Road Station and also at Ward Road. So what we really looked at were two things in this catalytic project. The first was accessibility to the Wheat Ridge Ward Station from the neighborhoods surrounding that station. And we also looked at Ridge Road from the Wheat Ridge Ward Station to the Ridge Road Station and looked at how to improve Ridge Road to catalyze development in a way that both communities would share that. So the first piece was in this multimodal accessibility. Again, all of this you can take a look at. But I think one of the key pieces of this, when we ended this, all of these studies ended at the end of December. We had some remaining funding from this study that the contractor didn't use, so the contractor agreed to do some extra work. So they particularly looked at this issue of a traffic signal at Ward Road and 50th Avenue, because that was an issue that was identified in the initial study. I understand the results of that were shared with multiple stakeholders, including CDOT and RTD, and it doesn't look like that's moving forward, but hopefully that will move forward in the future. There were a bunch of issues, there were a bunch of opportunities around that were really critical. One opportunity was that if you're running the buses down 52nd, they have to go down 52nd and then they turn and come into the station area. So you're basically moving them down a road that's less accessible than it, and more indirectly accessible than if you just brought them in on 50th. The other issue was that with the traffic signal on 50th, it would increase bicycle and pedestrian accessibility into that station. So again, this stuff is available, and I'm sure your staff can help you through it, walk you through the results of that. The Ridge Road improvements included on-street bike lanes, continuous sidewalks on the north side of the street, and inclusion of turn lanes. There were several profiles done on how this could be done both immediately in the future with a relatively modest investment, and in the future with a more full investment that would require acquisition of some of the properties, because that stretch of Ridge Road gets a little funny there because there are properties that are in the right-of-way right now, and you would have to acquire those properties. But the work that was done identified short and medium and long-term strategies for improving Ridge Road. So in terms of what we heard from stakeholders, the first big issue was this idea of first and final mile connectivity. Now, all of the development that's going to occur in the Gold Corridor is not going to occur just around the station areas. It's going to occur further out. You're not going to be able to put all the housing at the station areas, or even the affordable housing at the station areas. So what that means is it's going to go out from the station areas, and what the citizens identified was, if that's going to happen, then we really have to think about how to improve that first and final mile access to the station. So even if you live farther away than the immediate station area, you can still get there to take advantage of transit. That included improved signage and wayfinding. They also identified the need for more public education around transit, safety, and this safety issue comes up again and again in all of our studies and the Sustainable Communities Initiative. It not only involves personal safety at the station, but it involves things like if you're going to walk to the station and you have really bad sidewalks, that's a personal safety issue. Looking at transit-oriented development and economic opportunity, multimodal transportation access to the stations, including bicycle and pedestrian, and also the bus routes. Access to opportunity, this idea of transit in the fare structure and how the fare structure issue can be solved. And many of you already know that RTD is working on a fare study. Your community is probably involved in that, but this was a major issue that came up again and again in all the corridors. Employment, housing, especially the issues around displacement, affordability, and senior housing. And certainly this last one, the preservation and enhancement of existing neighborhoods. In our eagerness to build new neighborhoods in the vicinity of transit, what we don't want to lose sight of is there are some very vibrant neighborhoods, and we want to make sure we maintain those neighborhoods. So the Corridor Working Group came up with a set of station-specific recommendations for both Wheat Ridge Ward Road Station and other station areas, and in a whole list of corridor-wide recommendations. Number 2 on here, you see you just can't escape it, the implementation of an affordable housing creation and preservation study. So actually taking that study and implementing the recommendations so that you can get out ahead of the game on the affordable housing. And one of the most important recommendations to come out of this is the first one, and that is to continue to collaborate on strategies, whether that be housing strategies or job creation strategies. The Corridor Working Group found that inter-jurisdictional collaboration would be really critical moving forward to achieve the ultimate goals and the ultimate possibilities of the transit build-out. So what are the key takeaways from all of this? The critical need for more affordable housing, the need for steps to make transit more affordable, to combine to reduce the combined housing and transportation costs for households, this idea of improving first and final mile connections, continuing collaboration, planning for transit areas must be comprehensive and consider the adjacent neighborhoods. And as you can imagine, this stuff is not all going to happen at one time. So you have to build flexibility into this so that you can, over time and as conditions change, respond to that and get ahead of it. And also the idea that we have to continue engaging the stakeholders and the people who live in these communities. That was a mouthful. I'm willing, unless I've totally boggled you, willing to entertain any questions or clarify any points that I may have glossed over. Yes, ma'am.
When you speak of affordable housing, could you define that a little bit more?
Sure, happy to. Affordable housing is, well, let me define what it's more than. It's more than low-income housing. I think affordable housing has this, I'll almost use the word stigma because we've run into it so much, that somehow this is all low-cost householding, subsidized households. That, in fact, this goes way beyond that. As previous speakers talked about, you have lots of people who need that kind of subsidized housing and affordable housing, but you also have first-time home buyers who can no longer buy in your community. I live on just the other side of Sloan Lake. I have two sons, one 31 and one 26. Neither of them could possibly afford to live in our neighborhood now. And finally, seniors. Those are really the three main groups, the people the low-income families, the first-time home buyers, and seniors.
Mm-hmm. One of the issues in Wheat Ridge is we have heightened density restrictions within our charter, and that prevents us from being able to build some of these options. Do you feel that that's an issue for our city?
I think it's something that you probably are going to have to address. I don't want to say it's an issue because I'm not one here to tell you that. I think that, one of the things that we've seen in other regions, how they've addressed this situation, you may not want to have high density everywhere in Wheat Ridge, but the fact is we've seen communities in the nation who've created TOD overlays to put that kind of density closer to transit so that people have more accessibility. So it's not an all or nothing approach. Does that make sense?
It does, thank you. And do you have cities that could be something we could look at as a model for that?
I can get you that information. I don't have that off the top of my head. I'll tell you one thing interesting because it came up earlier this evening. This idea of the construction defects issue is a huge challenge to us as a region. But even without construction defects, we would be looking at some significant obstacles to development. Several of our staff people from RTD, and our chairman of the board, Jackie Millay, the mayor pro tem of Lone Tree, all went to Salt Lake City in November for a TOD conference. And Salt Lake City is looking at about exactly the same vacancy rates, 3% as we're looking, and they don't have construction defects. They have those challenges because they're growing so quickly, and the demand, especially around transit, is so great that they can't keep up with it.
Okay, thank you.
This is a great opportunity to ask some questions because this has some great possibilities for our city to look at as making it a part of our planning in that area, as well as our city planning. There's some wonderful, remarkable people that worked on this. I got to work with a lot of them, which was absolutely unbelievable. I mean, we're really people who are very knowledgeable in the housing area, the economic development, marketing. So if there's some other questions you have, this is a good time. Mr. DiTullio. So
you mentioned that a lot of cities have put overlay districts within their community for the higher density and the height. Wheat Ridge did that similarly. Back in 2009 or 2010, the voters approved to remove the height and density restrictions in our urban renewal areas. And I believe 38th and Wadsworth is also exempted right now, and it really hasn't helped us attract anything other than what we're getting right now. So we've actually, how many acres, Patrick, would you say that we've exempted height and density from by the voters?
How many have we exempted?
Acres.
I don't know if I have that number. It's quite a few. You're correct. It's every urban renewal area except 38th Avenue. So the I-70 Kipling urban renewal area is the biggest, which encompasses this transit area.
So I think our voters have spoken several times on this. Once when we asked the voters to exempt the entire city, they said no. And then right after that, we went back with the compromise to say, how about the urban renewal areas? And they agreed to that. And that's one of our positives, that our voters have actually said, we agree to the higher density and the higher buildings in those areas where it's closer to transit, closer to the highway. So thanks for your probably endorsing what we've done.
Mr. Starker?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Aldretti. Nice presentation. We had a, Urban Land Institute was in our city to do a technical advisory panel on the Wheat Ridge Ward Road Station. They came back, and if my summation is correct, and I listened correctly, that sort of the traditional do some retail and housing right at the station didn't look like that neighborhood was really configured for that. They looked at the industrial base that was out there, and they said probably a better way to look at development in that station area would be sort of primary employment and bringing people to that location in order to have employment. Does that coincide with the findings that you encountered in your study?
Well, I will say that we didn't look specifically at the development patterns at that station. What we really looked at was the accessibility issues, so the infrastructure accessibility issues. But I will tell you that based on everything that I've heard, and I can only represent that, I think that is correct, quite frankly. I think that, I'll go back, remember that slide that I showed you that had all of the 29,000 units and 14 million square feet?
Yeah.
That proves the point. Not every station is going to be residential, commercial, retail mix. The whole thing you see now about what's sexy with TODs, you have 5 stories, retail on the first floor, residential above it, residential office mix. It's a very cookie-cutter approach to TOD, which everything that we have seen through all of our studies basically it rejects that. What all of this says is that you need to look at the context in which it's going to occur and say, okay, given this context, this makes the most sense. I would say the caveat that I would use to that is to say that as we looked at the Ridge Road improvements, you can probably get more residential along Ridge Road if you improve Ridge Road. So it may not be directly at that station area. The second thing that I would say is that this whole idea of first and final mile connections just supports that, saying where you put that, you should build that thinking about not only where it goes, but how it connects to everything else. So you may not have high density, maybe elsewhere in your community, but it's going to be important to think whether it's bus service or pedestrian bicycle access, how you get people from where they are to the stations, because it's that density that's going to drive the use of transit. That make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
I also recall there was a strong residential component to it as far as around the station.
Yeah, but if you look at our zoning map and the map of our borders, and the zoning map, by the way, is on the website for the city of Wheat Ridge, our zoning is almost entirely industrial in that area. The areas that are available for housing are in Arvada, not in Wheat Ridge. So we do have some small areas that are available for housing, but it would require massive rezoning for us to have housing close to the station.
I'll speak to that real quickly. Yeah, that area has been overlaid with a mixed-use transit-oriented development zoning, so it would allow for some residential for sure. But you're right. I don't think there's not as much room, and as Mr. Starker said, the ULI panel basically said it's probably not ripe for high-density residential, but they definitely did say a residential, as further you get away from the core of the industrial, there'd be room for residential.
Yeah, I think that the important piece of this is that often, and I think historically, when we've looked at transit, we have thought about how do you use transit to get people from outside areas where the residential is to the inner city where the commercial is, so it's a matter of getting people from the bedroom communities to where the jobs are. And that's not true anymore. The fact is that people are going to commute both ways. There are people who are going to live closer to the core city and commute out to work. So that's why I think you have to be be very open to what those station areas are. Maybe, that's the station that people come to work at. The other point that I will make that's come up, and I have found this particularly interesting myself, is how you build flexibility into that planning. Because the fact is this may not happen in a year when your corridor opens. That development may not occur even in the first 5 years, because people are going to wait and see, quite frankly, what those transit patterns are before they make a lot of the investment choice. However, what you are seeing, and it's really interesting, many of you may be familiar with the Alameda Station development that's going on downtown right now. They are building those buildings with first floor parking that later can be converted to retail. So depending on the market, there's this evolutionary look at how you build in these stations so that it can change over time.
That's interesting. Councilmember DiTullio.
Patrick, when we did when the voters approved the height and density elimination of those urban renewal areas, was this area eliminated also?
Yes.
So right now, it's not under height and density restrictions.
Not the charter restrictions, but they're under the current mixed-use zoning.
The charter isn't on this section. So if council wanted to increase height and density in that area, they could by changing the zoning.
Correct.
Right. So that's why I want to make clear is that this area has already been exempted from the charter by the voters, and if council wants to make it higher density or higher buildings, you do that through the code change, not necessarily the charter. And that's how it is on all of these locations along I-70 and in the urban renewal areas, is that you can make code changes to actually increase the height and the density rather than the charter. And I think that you make a good point that we don't want to be a cookie cutter community like everybody else. That's why Wheat Ridge is Wheat Ridge. And so that if we have some nuances in our code or our charter that makes us a little bit unique and helps us be that desirable. I mean, our property values are skyrocketing right now, so I can't say that we're doing something wrong. And like the affordable housing part, there's a lot of places where we could actually look at scraping and building new if we could, and with a higher density in those areas, like on Wadsworth or along I-70, where we could have some higher quality projects.
Councilmember.
What bus service, how is bus service going to change, especially as relates to the park and ride that's on Ward Road?
I don't want to speak to that because I don't work for RTD. I do, and my experience is there's a lot of people who work for RTD who want to speak to it, quite frankly. My understanding, as RTD has explained, is that they, probably about now, they're looking at those service route changes. It starts about a year before they actually open the transit to look at at the potential impacts to routes. So I don't know what the ultimate answer to that question is. I know that RTD is very sensitive after what happened on the West Line with the 16 Limited to be more thoughtful and maybe a little more flexible, because as many of you know, they really got beat up after they eliminated and rerouted some of those routes upon which people depended. So I think that they learned their lesson now. I think they're being much more thoughtful in their approach. And I would encourage you to invite representatives of the RTD staff to come have that discussion with you.
More questions of Mr. Aldretti? It looks like it. I think we will. I think we can go ahead and let him leave. Huh?
Yeah, that's it. Our plan is to, we received the draft report of the ULI TAP study about a week ago, I believe. So I think our plan is to bring that back and then talk about that and also what you heard tonight, and see how they mix together. So we'll have that in the near future.
So what you're saying is we'll look at the URL plan as well as this plan and the possibility of including this in some of our own documentation.
Exactly.
Which I think would be very advisable, because there's some very wonderful thinking in here and a lot of expensive planning that we can make use of. Thank you very much, Paul.
Certainly. Thank you all.
Did you lose your agenda? Here you go.
I seem to have ate my agenda. Okay, staff report with ADA transition plan.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, Steve Wynn is here to just give you a very brief update on how we're moving forward on the ADA transition plan. Thanks.
Thank you, Patrick. Last year, through budget planning and other planning sessions, the Public Works Department has indicated that we'll be developing an ADA transitional plan this year, so I'm here to update everybody tonight. As far as federal requirement, the requirement comes down that state and all local government to come up with an ADA transitional plan to address and to develop a plan and to ensure that individuals with disability are not excluded from programs, services, and activities. Pedestrian facilities is an example of a program. In a nutshell, what's required in a transitional plan, the big piece of it will be a self-evaluation of all city-owned and maintained infrastructures, either a public buildings or in the right-of-way, such as streets. Other part would be developing and posting a public notification for information system that is accessible and used by people with disabilities. Other pieces are designing of an ADA compliance coordinator, designated of ADA compliance coordinator as a point of contact to implement the transitional program. And the last piece of that is to provide formal grievance procedure for filing complaints. So those are the elements that we are to put together. As far as public city-owned and public facilities, buildings, we would have City Hall, Recreation Center, and Active Adult Centers. Those are the building portion of it. The other facilities is mostly in the right-of-way, and they are like curb ramps, sidewalks, shared use trails, transit access, and traffic signals. As far as facility assessment, what have we done to date for buildings? The Parks and Recreation Department have completed the audit, and they are working on implementing recommendations from the audit as funding allows. As far as streets, sidewalks, and trails and all other pieces in the right-of-way, the Department of Public Works right now is preparing to conduct an inventory citywide. That's going to be an enormous piece. That is to determine the needs and see how far we're in terms of meeting compliance, the program. Once we have a chance to inventory and assess all the needs, and we have to develop a multi-years implementation plan. Obviously, all the deficiencies are going to be so enormous, there's no way that it can be realistically be done in a year. So we have to plan spread out on multi-years in order to take on the program needs. And also that, financial, feasible, that could be the driving in terms of how much we can do. In terms of inventory preparation for this features out in the right-of-way, we are right now setting up GIS mapping and database. And we are also in the process of hiring intern for this summer so that we can start that field work. As far as next steps, again, just mentioned that once we get an intern on board, we're gonna have that individual gonna be collecting data all summer long into fall 2015, and then later in the fall 15, we'll be developing program policy for that as well, and we'll come back to council around fall again to update where we're at. And that's it. Open for questions.
Thanks, Steve. Any questions? Mr. Jatuli?
Just one quick question. We're not planning on hiring a person for this ADA coordinator, are we? It'd just be a staff person that would be assigned that title?
No, just an intern right now to do the work over the summer, to inventory what our inventory is, our infrastructure needs are. So no staff at this point.
Yeah.
How about in the future? I mean, can't we?
No plans unless there's becomes a mandate or a requirement that we have to do so. But there are no mandates at this point.
Thanks.
One of the possibilities we could have staff to be the designated ADA coordinator, but they have to go through training and certifications.
Councilmember Pond?
Thanks, Steve. I appreciate the update. My question, I think, is related
to the work, the inventory work that's going to be completed. Looks like it's going to be completed in the summer or fall with the intern. And then you're going to bring it back to us, a draft plan document. There is some prioritization, and I'm wondering what citizen input, community input, folks with disabilities, how will we engage folks in actually the act of prioritization? I assume that we're going to find a list of things and that staff is going to put their head to it, but are we going to be able to involve some other people in that?
I think that will probably take into consideration as we getting close to that. As in terms of priority, we got to know what we're up against, how much we have out there, how much of partial compliance, non-compliance, and then we have to draft a plan, what area we want to hit first. So we have basically a game plan once we know what that inventories would be.
Okay. My suggestion or request is that we do have a chance at some point to get some folks involved in looking at that inventory and helping with the prioritization before we, see a plan that has already been prioritized without that input. So, at some point, if we can at least get a heads up, there's some folks I think who would be excited to share their input with that.
So George, you would like to see some more community input on this?
Well,
That's what I'm hearing.
yeah, just to help.
Sure.
A set of eyes helping with the prioritization.
We'll make sure that happens.
Okay, any other questions? Mr. Urban?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. With respect to the length of the transition plan, how many years are we expecting that transition plan to be rolled out over?
That is a good question, and I don't think there is any set time. I think it all depends on how much do we have to bring into compliance. And then again, there's that financial factor, is how much we can reasonably support the plan. And that will dictate a lot on spreading number of years that people to complete it. But it's, researching with other communities, there is no fixed set time period to be in full compliance.
Sure. And then my next question is relative to existing infrastructure and or missing infrastructure that's currently not there. Would that be counted in an inventory? So if a street doesn't currently have a sidewalk, would that be included or not included in the?
I would think that will be part of that element for consideration.
Okay.
So federal and state compliance is important as far as the time, or do we have any sort of dates on?
I think our thought right now is to at least to have a plan and a game plan,
Okay, and that'll work for us?
I think so,
Okay.
yep.
Mr. DiTullio?
So as we know, Harlan West on 38th Avenue has substandard sidewalks, and that's one of the things the community has asked for is improved sidewalks for ADA and accessibility. So if we were to actually agree on something for 38th Avenue, we would start looking at a sidewalk to improve the sidewalks from Harlan West. Could this study be part of that, improving of that, or do we have to go back and redo it? I mean, can we kill two birds with one stone so that we can have to do it twice? Because there's obviously probably a lot of substandard and things that are not good on 38th Avenue from Harlan West.
Once we inventory citywide, we would probably the one with high priority gonna rise to the top. The opportunities we're gonna take on is if we happen to do a major CIP project of any sort, that's opportunity to upgrade in that area. The other opportunity is what we've been doing for years is for any street that we overlay, and that's the time we're gonna upgrade those facilities too. So through those two opportunities, yes.
So my suggestion would be is if we're going to be looking at 38th Avenue, it's not completed, and we know we need to make some changes. So as you go through your inventory, would it be wise to do inventory 38th Avenue first from Harlan West as part of this plan, so that if we do decide to make some changes on 38th Avenue, we have this plan, the inventory already in place? Would that make sense to do 38th Avenue first from Harlan
We'll
West?
make a note, again, those are the best opportunities that we would take that and upgrade the facility at the same time.
But I mean, as you do your inventory,
It's the inventory piece he's
Sure.
asking about, yeah.
Okay.
I think,
would it make sense to do your inventory first on 38th, since that's one of our hot spots?
We can certainly do that.
Does that make sense?
yeah, makes sense.
I have another question. In this preparation for the ADA transition plan, I know we're looking at inventorying our infrastructure, but is there any plans or discussions around inventorying our zoning policies or ordinances or anything else that would be intersecting with ADA or conflicting with ADA?
In my sense, I don't think so, because any improvements related to development or zoning of any sort, I think that the expectation is that all developments have to build everything to ADA standards so that we won't have to deal with any of those deficiencies.
Okay.
So they will have to build it in compliance with ADA.
So we're not expecting any kind of audit of our current ordinances or policies related to zoning or anything like that?
Not as part of this process, and have we had an audit by anybody
yet.
that we know of? But as Steve mentioned, I think, we have to, we're required to build in compliance with ADA requirements, so there's nothing in our code that goes against the ADA requirements.
Right. Each development, usually they would use all of our existing construction standards, and all of those constructions have been added to make sure that it meet ADA compliance.
Okay, thank you.
So we're in compliance on all of those at this point? Construction standards?
For new stuff, yes.
Exactly. Any other questions? Well, this was just an update for us, Steve, and you're going to come back in the fall and give us
Yes,
an
ma'am.
All right.
Good. Thanks,
Thank you
Steve.
very much. Okay, I think we can move on to code enforcement strategy update.
And the chief's presentation is going to be as short or as long as possible to get Mr. Dahl here to talk about construction defects. So, Mr. Dahl had a previous meeting, and he says he's hopefully he gets here by 7:30 or 7:45. So, the chief is a filler here. Not that it's not important. It's not that it's not important.
I've been called a lot of things, but never a
But he's a filler this evening. So.
I've always been the bench, but never the filler. I guess that's what a bench player is.
Do the standard. Is there any questions?
Well, I've asked Division Chief Lawrence to present on the code enforcement strategies. Jim has been is the lead on the project and is working with community development and our community services team members on this. So I asked Jim to come here tonight to just update you on where we're at and our plans for neighborhood meetings. Jim?
So you might already be up to speed on everything. We've talked a couple of times about this. We've talked just 2 weeks ago at the last study session about the TLC neighborhood program. We've got the name in place. We've come up with a little logo that is on those flyers that we think is pretty nifty. And we've scheduled neighborhood meetings for both of the neighborhoods, the Clearvale neighborhood and the Clear Creek Station neighborhood. We have already begun assessment on all three neighborhoods. We haven't advertised the 44th Avenue corridor too much yet. We wanted to get a head start on the neighborhoods. We think in about 2 weeks we'll be able to start on doing the area neighborhood with help of Steve Art to get into that 44th corridor and talk to the business owners there. But we've already started assessing properties. We're pretty much done with 44th Avenue already. Our code officers have gone out there and assessed each property. They found the specific issues that are in those areas. We're going to be mapping those and working with the property owners to correct those issues. We've got probably more than half of each neighborhood already assessed. So we'll be going out, as you've seen with the flyers, we'll be going out tomorrow actually at, I believe we're in Clearvale tomorrow. Yeah, we're in Clearvale tomorrow passing out the flyers. We'll be in the neighborhood in the morning from 9 to 12 and then again from 3 to 6 and inviting people to the neighborhood meetings. The neighborhood meetings in Clearvale will be at Piatris at 7 o'clock on the 13th. And then we'll be passing out the flyers next week, Tuesday the 12th, in the Clear Creek Station neighborhood. And that location for the meeting will be on the 20th at the Trinity Baptist Church at 45th and Newland. So you all are, of course, invited to come out and participate if you'd like to walk with us and pass out flyers and talk to people in the neighborhood, tell them what we're trying to accomplish, and come to the meeting, and we'll certainly have some time for you to speak to the folks and tell them why we think that this is a great thing for Wheat Ridge, and we really do. We think this is going to be we think this is a good program. We're going to kind of roll our East Wheat Ridge project into the TLC brand, I guess you would call it, and hopefully we'll keep on expanding. We'll have more TLC neighborhoods in the city, and I think it's showing some real promise. We will have dumpsters in those neighborhoods that we've talked about. Right now, they're to be announced. I just heard from Britta from 2020 that we will have those dates tomorrow. So we'll figure out when Waste Management can stick a dumpster out in there, and we'll be advertising those things too. So I think, unless you have some questions, I think that's all I've got for an update right now.
Do you have extra flyers that we could give out this weekend at the 44th Avenue Cruise?
Oh, yeah.
We might have residents at the end when we have the award ceremony, so if you have some extra flyers, we could pass them out then.
So we'll have several of our folks out working that, and I'll make sure that they've got piles of them for you.
Yes.
Was there a dumpster day planned for District 1? Bud and I were looking at dates.
Yeah, we're going to have one in the East Wheat Ridge neighborhood. I don't have a date yet for you. It's kind of separate planning to these things, but we're going to have one there. We're going to have some in other parts of the city too. We wanted to get these things set up first, so I'll check with.
Check in with Bud and I on
You bet. So we may, Britta may have that on the list for tomorrow. Maybe we'll have a date for you tomorrow.
If I may ask either one of the District 1 representatives, you had done this previously for the east section. Was that just District 1?
Yes.
Of course, we don't. Anything that you would like to offer, or suggestions or thoughts, or something that came to you? You held meetings. Did you also pass out flyers?
Yeah, we've held meetings, and we've done dumpster days on 2 or 3 years in a row, and to great acclaim. I mean, I think people are anxious to have this program. There's a little carrot, but there's a carrot and stick approach. But I think it's been very effective in sort of generating community and helping the neighborhood clean up. So
we had high school students pass out flyers to all the houses in the area a couple times, and they dropped them off the different sections, and that helped a lot because everybody knew. So the high school kids did it about a week before.
And they did some. I think we also had the students do some staffing at the dumpster locations, and
to help putting things in.
Yeah, turned out to be very favorable, and kind of keeping the street swept up while we're doing it, and it was a well-received program.
So there are some restrictions on what people can dump. Generally, they don't take paints, hazardous materials, electronics, those kinds of things. And that's the other reason we either had volunteers or high school students there to watch those. The other thing we learned too on this is that we don't want to drop the dumpster off too soon, because what we found a couple years ago was they were filled up the morning of the event, and that was problematic. So. I did want to touch just on one other thing as well. We have gotten just a couple of citizen concerns in regards to some of the efforts that we've taken up there in regards to some warnings, and the general feel, by a couple of residents that, well, you've never done anything, before in regards to this, and why are you doing it this, why are you doing it now? I've been doing this sort of thing for years and years and years. So I think where elected officials can really help us in regards to that, when you hear that citizen concern expressed is to remind citizens that we're really, shooting to make our neighborhoods and our business corridors more attractive, and to our community members and visitors to the community. And it's not that we're out to punish anybody. We're just out to to gain compliance, and we'll work with folks as we can. I think that's been our model. We've proven that in the past. So, but we may start to hear some of that, because some of these areas haven't, I won't say they've been ignored, but they haven't been the priority that East Wheat Ridge has over the last couple of years.
Ms. Wooden?
Just because you mentioned it, have we ever done a chemical or a pickup like that before in the city?
What we'll do on that is when people call, we'll divert them out to the Rooney Valley hazardous material cleanup facility that they have. People can drop off paint and weed killer and those kinds of things. We've participated in shred-a-thons, not necessarily in Wheat Ridge, but there's one coming up in Jefferson County at the Sheriff's Office that we as Police Department participate in through Metro Crime Stoppers. And we could certainly look at something for electronics, but there tends to be a cost associated with that, and we'll certainly research that. And
We've been doing electronics. The Sustainability Committee, I think the last 2 years has had electronics drop off, but yeah, we do charge.
But not like the old paint and stuff.
But yeah, we haven't gotten into that. As the chief mentioned, we could look into it, but there is definitely a cost to it, and
we can look into
something
it.
we can look into.
Cost and let you know.
I was just curious what it would cost.
Any other questions?
I can go a little longer if you need me to.
More item
we
still,
want
don't you?
an item here.
You got one more item.
Yeah, we can drag along.
Thanks for no PowerPoint.
Oh, Mr. Fitzgerald.
I would just like to say I would support us developing some kind of a drop-off. We tried to use that Rooney Ranch thing and found it very difficult to make that work for us. So if we could develop something for all those things you can't dispose of, light bulbs and all that other kind of stuff, it'd be good, even if you have to pay.
What were some of the difficulties, so that we can see if we can? Do you remember? Or just is it so far out or expensive?
No, I didn't go.
Okay.
But my son went, and they had to call somebody and wait.
Oh, okay.
And the person was on lunch break or something, and it took an hour or something to get somebody to come. And I don't know. I wasn't there, but I know that it was not a pleasant experience.
We'll look at what some other cities
we
are
can
doing.
research it and find out what we can do and what those costs might be, and bring that back.
So, when we looked over the budget and we looked at this, I thought that was something we already discussed, because I know I brought it up back then, because I had said, we're looking at certain areas, which is fine. I'm glad to help some areas that might need some help. But I think in the interest of our entire community, there might be some folks that, might not need the help with the big dumpsters, but could use the help with getting rid of their paint or electronics or those kind of things. So I thought that was something that was going to be looked at anyways. I guess everybody looks like it's news to them or something.
I think you mentioned it. Yeah. I don't know if there was any consensus to bring a program forward. I think we mentioned that we currently don't do it. Something we could look at, but I mean, it's definitely different than picking up trash.
Yeah, I mean, I just think, I'm just looking from my perspective, and from folks around me, or folks that might not have to pick up trash in my yard or big items in my yard, but it might be helpful as a citizen that that some of my dollars are going to help me as well to dump a couple paint cans or something, because I don't want to sneak it in the bottom of my trash can.
You can if you let it dry out.
So can we get a consensus to come back with some costs of that?
Looks like we have a consensus on that.
Yeah, we'll look into it, and we'll bring
Thank
the
you.
staff report back.
Anything else on this one? And you've got electronics, there's a charge.
Yeah, we are doing electronics too.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, I think if you let your paint dry out, keep the can off. At least in Denver, you could throw them then.
Yeah,
Just gotta let them dry out completely before you toss it.
it takes a while.
And it's legal.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, the chief's got one more item.
Okay, item 2C, Chief Brennan.
Thank you. So I wanted to make council aware of what we call a data-driven approach to crime and safety project that we're going to kick off this month. In fact, beginning next week, along the I-70 and Kipling corridor. So you've got a staff report and also a sort of a PowerPoint presentation, but Councilmember DiTullio is put up with me for 10 years, and he can't take my PowerPoint presentations anymore. So in the interest of, well, no, but that's what you implied, but that's okay. So I couldn't get it up anyway. So on the projector. So essentially, DDAX is sort of a problem-solving approach to crime and traffic concerns in a particular area. And in your staff reports and also in the PowerPoint, you'll see a couple of slides that what we call heat maps that will show you where we tend to be busier, both from a traffic accident perspective and a crime perspective. So on page 2 of the staff report, you'll see a map there, a heat map that shows traffic accidents from March of 2015, and you'll see that there's one really hot spot, the I-70 and Kipling corridor, and then you'll see there Wadsworth from 38th to 44th is another location that shows that we've got accidents, but it doesn't quite have the number of accidents we see in that I-70 and Kipling corridor. And you overlay that with crime data, and you'll see on the crime heat map that there are several areas that sort of pop up along Wadsworth, 38th Avenue, southeast side of the city, and then that I-70 and Kipling corridor is a pretty busy area, and that's historically has been a busy area for the department, particularly in the 10 years that I've been here as your police chief. So the approach that we're going to undertake on this required a lot of analysis, and it was based on this, we call it DDAX model. It was put together by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration and the Department of Justice as a way to, from an analysis perspective, to address issues of crime and traffic. So what we hope to do in this, essentially it's going to be about a 3 to 4 month project, is we've looked at the 2014 data so that we've got a good idea of what traffic accidents and the causes of accidents look like in that I-70 and Kipling corridor, and also from a crime perspective, what's going in that corridor. And what we hope to do is have an impact on that. Whether we displace it, we make our property owners and residents more aware of crime. In our presence in the area, what we hope is that our presence in the area will cause a reduction in both traffic accidents and crimes. So the idea is not necessarily to go in there and write a lot of tickets, but the idea is to be very, very visible, because what we do know from years and years of data is if people see police cars in an area, they tend not to commit crime. They tend to say, I'm going to go somewhere else to commit crime. So if that's what they intend to do. The other unique thing about this particular corridor is we have a lot of large multifamily housing units, and we have some older hotels and motels, and then we've got some new businesses that have gone into the area. So there's a flyer that was attached to that staff report too that we're going to distribute to property owners, residents, business owners in the area, letting them know of our efforts in the area that they're going to see on certain days of the week and times of the day, and those are going to fluctuate based on the data that we have. They're going to see more patrol cars in that particular area. So you may hear from citizens about an increased police presence there. You may see more traffic stops going on there. Our hope is really to have police officers be as visible as they can during these days or times of the week, so we can see if that has an impact on some of the crime issues that we have. From a crime perspective, really what we're seeing in this particular corridor are motor vehicle thefts, recovered stolen vehicles, burglaries and some economic crimes, fraud, forgeries, those kinds of things that are going on in some of our lower tier hotels and motels. So our hope is that we can have a positive influence on both the traffic collisions and also crime. The other challenge that we have in this particular area is we have a pretty narrow corridor on Kipling that goes through that I-70 area. So, we're optimistic we can have an impact on that, but some of this may have to result at some point. We know at some point we're going to see a remodel of that intersection and what that looks like. But this is our effort to see if we can have a positive influence on these things. So I'd be happy to answer any questions. I don't know if Jim has anything else he wants to add to it, but we don't, just one other thing real quick, we don't anticipate a lot of additional, certainly not a budget supplemental. We have about $8,000 in justice assistance grant funds that we were going to use for this project. We're also going to use our crime and traffic team. We'll use them when they're on duty. And we do have a little bit of an allocation on our patrol overtime budget that we use for community policing projects, and we'll utilize some of that throughout the summer and see if we have an impact. Oh, thank you. And we're also going to partner with the State Patrol and Arvada on some of our dates, since we're obviously going to impact both of those jurisdictions. So they have both offered to help us.
Will they be swapping and coming into that area as well?
Arvada will probably work their area of the city north of 52nd, 54th Avenue,
Okay.
in that area, and CSP certainly has jurisdiction on the State Highway Kipling and I-70.
So there'll be like a presence on both sides, which is
Yeah.
pretty
Yes.
substantial.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much. Questions? Sorry, Ms. Davis.
Thanks for the report, and I know it was funny because I asked you some questions last week, not knowing this was coming its way. And so I just have a question because you probably saw what was on 9 News or the newspaper regarding Lakeside and their increased activity, but I would suspect there'd be increased activity because it went from a flat lot to a developed property, so I would think that there would be some increased activity there. But my understanding, and I think what I would like clarification on is, and I believe I've seen this before in police studies because my master's program did a study of crime rates and where it was. But I guess what I want to ask is that, or have you clarify, is that crime activity, if it be shoplifting, car break-ins, those types of things, they're not specific to certain retailers. Actually, developments, those happen regardless of what retailers are in the development. Like I can think of a couple, and I don't want to say, because I don't want people to feel bad that that area might have had a high break-in or crime rate. But what I guess what my question is it's not based on the basic, perhaps the business that's in there, but a lot of that activity happens regardless of what's in the structure. Does that make sense?
So I'm going to take a swag at it.
Yeah.
So there are about 28 factors that influence crime. So factors like socioeconomic demographics in a particular area, the location to lower tier kinds of hotels and motels, the location compared to transportation corridors, certainly the types of businesses that go in. They can certainly have policies that can influence crime. Most of the businesses that we work with in our city, all of the businesses we work with in our city are very proactive in regards to putting in place crime prevention kinds of strategies that reduce crime. The location as it compares to density, the higher the density, the more people you have there, the more people that you have there, you're going to see, some increases in crime. The type of police department you have, whether they're proactive or reactive, their approach to, to crime and traffic efforts. Certainly our efforts in this particular area, you mentioned, I didn't see the Lakeside story, but certainly there were some stories last week about some jurisdictions who, do traffic enforcement as revenue generators. That's not our approach. We're very problem-oriented in regards to how we approach traffic and looking for the, the causes of accidents. So that's what we target. We just don't go out there and write tickets. But there's a host of, the number of juveniles you have in a community, particularly males between 15 to 25, because they have a propensity to commit more crime than others. There's I know I'm leaving a ton of factors out, but there's just a number of factors that influence them. Yes, tons of factors.
Did you get your question answered well enough? Okay, Mr. Starker.
What I can do, if you'd like, is we can do a comparison of our 3 commercial locations that we talked about to see what those crime rates look like. If that helps you, that's not a problem in terms of pulling an analysis together to look at those specific retail centers to see what crime looks like in those, to see if you have any other questions. I'd be happy to do that for you. Okay.
Would that be like more predominantly in liquor stores or jewelry stores or something like that? Is that what you're thinking?
I think we were talking about our 3 specific commercial corridors. Our commercial corridor at 38th and Sheridan, 38th and Wadsworth, and 32nd, 38th and Youngfield. Yeah.
And I think, I'm guessing from what you just said, we could probably almost guess that based off of demographic.
You could, yeah.
All of that kind of stuff.
The many things that contribute.
Yeah.
Mr. Starker.
Thank you, Chief and Chief Lorenz. We have scarcity in our police department and our personnel to do this, and we're going to allocate more resources to this enterprise. Will there be? Are there any impacts that we should look at in the rest of the city? Or any tips for citizens if we're going to do a short-term concerted application in this area? Are there any tips that we should have citizens watch out for in other parts of the city, other than being diligent in practicing sort of safe behavior and watching out for their neighbors?
So our crime and traffic team we're going to use primarily when they're on duty. So it's, every year we identify priorities for that team. This year, this will be, one of their priorities. They'll still have time to do the other things they do from a crime and a traffic perspective, but we're going to take, a percentage of their time and allocate it to this. And then when our officers have free time, when they're not, taking calls for service or involved in any other projects, we're going to try to focus them there as well during these time frames. And then we'll have some overtime available. So I don't suspect that citizens will see an impact, in terms of delay in, getting to their call for service or not handling their crimes. So I think we'll be in pretty good shape. The flyer that we're sending out does give citizens a phone number to call if they see suspicious behavior, and that'll be part of our focus on this is to get citizens and business owners engaged in this, so they're sharing information with us.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Wooden.
I was just going to add the dates and times that will be there is pretty narrow. We can adjust that through the data that we have. So you may or may not notice if we're there or not. We're hoping that they notice. I mean, the whole idea is that if the red and blue lights are flashing in the intersection, then people won't commit crimes. So that's what we're trying to accomplish there, and it's not a revenue producing kind of thing. I don't think we'll see more traffic summonses as a result of that. It's more like contact people in the area and let everybody else see that that's what we're doing.
Then I'll keep my lead foot off of the accelerator during those times.
I'm glad the city attorney's here and he's aware that we're doing this.
So this is really a warning, huh? Any other questions on this?
It's not a question, it's more of a comment. I really support this program. A couple months ago, I heard a presentation from Jefferson County, and you were there, Joyce, about human trafficking. And I was shocked to hear in that presentation that those hotels are one of the areas for Jeffco for human trafficking that they work on. And so I really appreciate the program and that you guys are going to do that work. I also just want to make a comment that in light of everything we hear every single week about the police across the country, how much I think the majority of residents so much appreciate Wheat Ridge Police Department and everything you guys do. So just want to let you know, regardless of what goes on across the country, we know how hard you work and we really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for saying that. Here, here. Great. All right, I believe we are ready to move on to construction defects. Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Chief and Division Chief Lorenz.
Just off the bench again.
They filled quickly. They filled very well. Mr. Dahl is here.
Mr. Dahl is here. We've just heard several people discuss discussion defects, so now it's our opportunity to hear what you have to say. We're
Okay.
aware that the bill didn't pass.
Bill did not pass. You have a memo from Mr. Goff and myself that gives you the background on this, pretty good summary. Let me make a couple of points to kind of add to what is in the memo, and then I'd be pleased to take your questions in any direction the council has. The issue that is attempted to be addressed by either the Lakewood ordinance, which you have copied here, and is really, I think that's probably the easier to read and the more comprehensive, and then the Senate bill, both address the perception and probably the reality that the multi-unit, especially owner-occupied multi-unit development industry has been constrained by the threat of lawsuits over construction defects, and that has dried up not only developer interest but also financing for those projects, and the combination of those two things has led to a decline in the number of those projects being constructed. And Lakewood has taken the position that they really need that kind of housing as a part of their mix. It's in their comp plan. If you read their whereas clause in their ordinance, I think that tells a pretty good kind of narrative of sort of what the problem is and what the problem is as seen by Lakewood. I found it interesting in reading their ordinance that a number of the things that are true there are true here. They've talked about the light rail line. Well, Wheat Ridge has a light rail line. And the same kinds of issues have come up in both communities. Obviously, it's for this council to decide whether the same thing is true here or not. But in any event, that pattern has been true for a number of years. The legislature attempted to address it via a Senate Bill 177 that the League supported. That bill focused on only a part of the issues that are the focus of the Lakewood ordinance, which is more comprehensive. So why don't I tell you kind of the key things in the Lakewood ordinance, and I'll make mention of where that Senate Bill 177 would have come in that regard. Lakewood, first, you'll notice, makes certain that they emphasize that as a home rule city, they can do this, because what you're really doing is trying to constrain some exercise of rights to sue. And quite likely some of the opposition to Senate Bill 177 came from people who are saying, look, that's not something that you have the right to legislate on. So
Mr.
Lakewood
Dahl,
is...
could you be sure and use your microphone?
Oh, sorry.
Just so that our...
It's a pretty small room. You mean...
Well, no, I mean...
Do you mean
it's-
that this voice can't be heard?
Well, I'm thinking of the
Oh, TV land. All right, fine then.
people who are listening.
Fair enough. All right.
Thousands out there.
The thousands out there. In any event, Lakewood makes the point in the whereas clause and early in the ordinance that as a home rule municipality, this is something within their control to govern, because it's a matter of local concern, zoning and health, safety, welfare. So they make that point. Secondly, the first sort of whole half, I guess, of the Lakewood ordinance involves requiring a claimant's notice be filed as a precondition to your being able to file a lawsuit against the developer on a construction defect. You must first file a notice with the developer, with the builder, And they've done a kind of a generous list of who it could be: the designer, the builder, the contractor, the engineers. And really that list amounts to the list of potential defendants, in any kind of construction defect lawsuit. And I think it was well drawn. On balance, I think it's a well-written ordinance. But before you can file your lawsuit, a precondition is you file this notice with the builder identifying with some particularity what the problem is, and giving them the opportunity to respond. They have to acknowledge the notice. If they don't acknowledge receiving that notice and send you back that, then you're free to sue them. So there are a number of places where you're, as the homeowner, you're allowed back into the court system. Really, what we're talking about is legislation that keeps you out of as a plaintiff that believes there's injury to your property as a result of a construction defect, keeps you out of the court system until certain conditions have been satisfied. But if they aren't satisfied in the right order, then you drop out of that holding pattern and you can bring your lawsuit. And so it's not that you can't ever, there are preconditions, and one of those is you send a notice, the developer acknowledges that. If the builder does not, then you're back into the lawsuit scene. If the builder does, then the builder has the right to repair. And that's detailed in a fair amount of detail, I think, and pretty well done in the Lakewood ordinance. Has to give a warranty of repair on that. The timeframes are fairly tight to have that all happen. There's an added alternate dispute resolution process, which is in the Lakewood ordinance. In addition, the Lakewood ordinance addresses something that is the main subject of Senate Bill 177, and that is condo declarations that would otherwise allow the condo executive board to bring suit are required to be either altered or preserved, depending upon how you look at it, to require notice to the builder and an opportunity to cure prior to the condo association being able to bring a similar lawsuit for a construction defect. And it goes on in both the Lakewood ordinance and Senate Bill 177 to say, look, if that's already true in your declarations, great, but you can't amend it out. If you try to amend it out, frankly, the law still applies. And importantly, before you can move forward with such a suit on behalf of the association, two things have to happen. You have to get 50% consent of all the owners rather than some smaller number executive committee. So that increases the hurdle that you have to get over to bring this lawsuit. And secondly, I think kind of interestingly, and it's in both the statute, proposed statute, and Lakewood's ordinance, you've got to give notice to the condo members before they're to give that consent of what it means about the lawsuit. What are the consequences of that? How long will the duration be? How do you expect to fund the lawsuit? What will be the impact of the lawsuit as it's pending upon your ability to refinance or otherwise convey your unit? In a sense, it reads a little bit, frankly, like a Tabor notice. That's what kind of occurred to me when I was reading that, which is, Tabor notice to say, hello, we'd like to increase taxes. Here's how much. Here's what our present debt structure is. Here's what our present revenue is. Here's what the revenue will be after if we impose the tax. Kind of full disclosure before you vote. And that noticing requirement is in there. And the statute also has kind of a similar alternate dispute resolution, mediation, arbitration provision. Again, as something that happens before you're released to the court system and can bring this lawsuit. And so that's the structure both of the bill, which is only about half of the picture, I think is probably fair to say, and the Lakewood ordinance, which is sort of the full picture. Because we don't have legislation, if you were to do it, you probably would do the whole thing. That's what I've got. Questions?
I do have a question. Can a condo owner decide not to be part if there's a HOA lawsuit? Can they withdraw?
Well, if there's an HOA lawsuit, the lawsuit's brought on behalf of the HOA.
So
if I'm outvoted as a condo owner and I vote against bringing a lawsuit, but it's more than 50% of the owners say yes, they want to, then the lawsuit is brought on behalf of the association.
That's what I wanted to know.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Pond.
You referred a couple times to the recitals at the beginning of the Lakewood ordinance, and I'm looking down at the whereas on the page 2 of their ordinance, and it says, whereas the city council finds that the health, safety, and welfare of Lakewood residents is being negatively impacted by the lack of housing options. Just two questions. One, it seems as though that's a required recital. Otherwise, it seems like they wouldn't put it in there. And the second question is to what extent does that, if it is required, does it have to be defended or validated? Those seem like strong terms: health, safety, and welfare.
I'll tell you this. I think that of the various recitals, that's probably the least important. I hate to say it that way. Pretty standard stock, health, safety, welfare. You put that in when you're doing a nuisance ordinance, and you put one in when you're doing the speed limit ordinance. It's a lot less specific than some of the other findings, which are particular to this arena.
So they didn't have to put this in?
No.
Okay.
And let's remember, this is legislation, so the legislative standard applies, and as long as you've got some rational basis for adopting legislation, it survives scrutiny. There's the additional potential challenge that you can see, and I mentioned Lakewood is preparing itself for, by saying, yes, it survives legislative scrutiny, but is it a matter of statewide concern and therefore preempted? And they've told that story too, and you've read that.
Councilmember DiTilio.
I agree with this ordinance. I mean, I'm glad you got it ready to go, because we had talked about this in January or February, and we were waiting. I had a feeling that this wasn't going to come to fruition at the Capitol, so I'm glad you jumped on and got it ready to go. Procedurally, if council was agreed to this is my suggestion, is that we would maybe bring this to the council as an emergency ordinance as soon as possible, so we can get it going, so that developers who want to build in the city have that up. They know right away that we're looking at it, and then go through that normal 90-day, or to go through planning commission and city council back. But the reason why I suggest that is it shows that we mean business to the development community. And also, I know that there's a developer possibly on 38th and Upham that was waiting for us to maybe, or the state, to come up with the ability to build condos on 38th and Upham possibly. So is there any reason why, if council agreed to this, that we couldn't bring it in as an emergency ordinance and then go through the normal process within those 90 days to solidify it and finalize it? Is there any problem for that?
No, you certainly have the right to do emergency ordinance, so they're good, as you point out, for 90 days. Let me also mention that it doesn't necessarily have to be placed in Chapter 26. It's not per se a zoning provision. It could be in the business section, Chapter 11. That's it doesn't necessarily amend any zoning district or a supplementary regulation. That's a reasonable place to put it, but it doesn't have to be there. So there's no reason you couldn't adopt it as an emergency and then do what council has occasionally done in the past, which is to immediately introduce it as a regular ordinance and go through the process.
So I guess as you go around the room, if anybody would like to maybe comment on emergency versus the normal process, I just think it would show that we're serious about it. I want that to get out now, because the building season is getting now, it's spring, summer, so that would just be my suggestion. That would just be my suggestion.
Mr. Fitzgerald.
I have no objection to doing this quickly, but I think we need to talk about it a little bit first. I have one concern here, or help me understand something. Let's say you have a development that consists of 10 buildings, and in each building there are 10 condos. Let's say that one of those buildings is affected with a construction defect and 9 are not. So in that case, do those 10 have to get the assent of the 90 in order to do anything?
If they're all part of the same common interest community, subject to the same, that's a good question, same declarations, then, and I think in your scenario you had 100 units altogether, then you would need to get the assent of 51 unit owners after this notice, et cetera.
And
process.
they're induced to not want to do this because their unit would be tied up.
Tied up in this lawsuit and.
So the 10, in essence, are out to lunch. Do they have any other option?
What that does is it prevents the association from bringing, if the 50% determines whether or not the association can bring suit. If the association fails to be able to bring suit, then you do have developer remedies here, or excuse me, the builder's right to cure. So if the votes aren't there to bring the lawsuit, then instead you have, as a unit owner, then you have the notice to the builder to repair, and the builder's right to repair, which is under a fairly tight time frame, and you rely on the provisions of the ordinance that say the builder's got, you give the builder a notice of a defect. That 50% rule does not prevent you, and that's not what stops you from sending a notice to the builder that there is a defect and they need to fix it. It stops you from bringing a lawsuit. And so long answer to your question, but your other remedy, if you're in a common interest community and the association doesn't let you sue, is that you go through the notice to the builder right to cure process.
But he's not compelled to do that other than.
That's great. He's not compelled to. No,
goodwill.
The builder can certainly ignore the notice or say, I don't think it's a defect. I'm not going to participate in that. And if that's the case, then that frees you for suit, except for the fact, of course, that you've got, if you're in a condo association, it's the association typically that brings that suit.
Can you think of anything that would protect, that would give some kind of a mechanism for a minority?
Yeah.
Because the majority is induced to not want to sue. So in that case, you'd have the tyranny of the majority.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Urban, were you done, Mr. Fitzgerald?
I guess my initial question would be to follow up on Councilmember Fitzgerald's question with respect to one homeowner today could not effectuate a lawsuit on behalf of the entire condominium association, correct? So that minority.
That's correct.
Protection is not there today.
That's correct.
Okay. Yeah. I guess the key thing for me in the Lakewood ordinance is that builder's right to repair, which is the first instinct of many developers or builders is to want to remedy the situation as is without having to go through the rigmarole of some kind of litigation. And it seems as though almost the intended goal of many people or many attorneys that are bringing these types of suits is to get it into litigation versus getting it through to some kind of resolution. And so I think anything that we can do to encourage repairs when repairs need to be made, and it looks like as you said, a very tight timeline relative to that it would give us a way to allow for things to be resolved. So we're not promoting construction defects by putting this in, we're protecting homeowners and giving them ways to resolve this. And I think that the minority is protected in that right now a builder may not be able to affect any kind of repair because of the threat of further litigation relative to the repairs. So that's, I think, an important piece of it. And as far as an emergency ordinance, I would be okay with putting together an emergency ordinance. The last condo built in Wheat Ridge was in 2005. That was over 10 years ago. So we've waited long enough to get something done. We were very prudent and very willing to wait and to see what the state legislature was able to do. And as it turns out, they weren't able to get the job done. So that falls back on us to take care of business. So I think doing it sooner rather than later would be appropriate given the amount of time that we've waited for something like this to come forward. So, thank you.
Ms. Wooden.
First of all, thank you for researching all this. I'm sure it was very cumbersome. And we're looking at the Lakewood ordinance. Do you see anything that Wheat Ridge needs to add or do differently? I mean, is it fairly comprehensive?
I think it's pretty comprehensive. In sort of going through it and preparing for tonight, one thing that occurred to me that I think would be good for me to do if I'm given direction by council to move forward would be to talk to my opposite number over in Lakewood, Tim Cox, their city attorney, and say, okay, you've had this on the books now for, it's I think a little over a year, looks like they did it in 2014. What would you do differently now? What's been your experience? Very often you get these things done in a hurry and you go, I don't see that there have been amendments, but there might have been that I don't have. So that's my answer to your question. I'd want to at least do that, but it's a pretty complete package, in my opinion.
Okay, I absolutely support this, and I support doing it in an emergency ordinance if that's what we want to do. I support that. Two things market-wise, I attend a lot of real estate meetings. Number one, we're hearing that developers still don't want to test this. And number two, the developers that are considering it almost can't afford the liability insurance because even though the ordinances, like in Lakewood, are in effect, the insurance community is tacking on some insurance that's almost outrageous and they can't afford it. So I support us doing it, but whether it's going to change our ability to build condos immediately, I'm just a little bit worried that we may not get what we want. And even though we know we need lower income, or affordable income, I should say, affordable income condos, and we want them built, it may be a while before we get to see it, but I absolutely support having the ordinance in place.
Mr. Urban again.
To that end, I think that one of the things that I'd like to consider in this ordinance is a sunset provision that would tie in with the state doing something around this. And as much as you're right that there may be insurance providers that aren't willing to take on the face of it, our ordinance being able to stop any type of situation coming forward, it does, again, put it back on the state legislature to say, we waited for you to do something, you didn't do it. Now it's incumbent on us to do what we can in the interim, but still push them to come up with some comprehensive, universal, statewide solution that would give the insurance companies that buffer, that cover that they need.
So you would like a sunset provision on it if we did something like that? Mr. Pond, I had next. Mr. Starker?
Thank you, Mr. Dahl, for putting this together. I had a couple of things that I wanted to comment on. One of them was sort of the under this, the time frames within which the builder needs to respond to is about 14 days. And in that sort of time frame, he needs to provide copies of all of the documents that he's probably ever gotten on the job.
I noticed that.
That to me, if you've got a 150 or 200 unit apartment or condo complex, and you've got 80 or 90 or 100 pages of plans and the spec books that are so thick that you can't imagine, and field reports and all of that information. That seems to be a lot of information to get together in 2 weeks. It's interesting in here that we have the builder has the the ability to tell the condo owner that I'm going to go and repair this, whether you'll want me to or not. He has the right, as I read this ordinance, to do that. Don't want to express an opinion on that, but that sort of leads me as a segue into sort of the discussion on how we get this. And I certainly, I'm a builder, and I certainly believe that that litigation and the Kiowa Act and state law that's over the last 10 years or so, 10 or 15 years, allowed the imbalance to occur relative to construction defects and the ability to repair or to mitigate the damages and the loss of insurance coverage for that product, and the economic, and where that's given us, where we really are not building any for sale multifamily housing in the moderate priced income sort of excluding the higher income, if you will. But I think we need to have a robust discussion of both sides of this issue. There are, there are housing advocates who advocated apparently forcefully enough to be able to defeat this in the state legislature, and I think that we need to have, before we finish this type of ordinance, be able to have that discussion here. So however we need to go, whether we need to do an emergency ordinance or whatever it is, I think we owe it to the citizens to have a robust discussion on this. Another facet in here that had been taken out of SB 177 was on the notice that that if the homeowners association is going to contemplate filing a lawsuit against the builder developer, there was a provision that the information that they were going to produce was not produced by their attorneys. And I know that in SB 177 that this was a provision that had survived, or that had really been part of the 2014 construction defect legislation, but had been excised out of the 2015 version of SB 177. There was one other feature that prior to Lakewood adopting this ordinance had been, I believe, first put together by Douglas County in their Public Works Department, which would be to provide what they call plat notes. And so that if you provided in the platting of a process that disputes were to be resolved by mediation or arbitration, that the fact that your project was platted with, and I'm not an expert in platting and all of those sort of things, but it seemed like a sort of a good way to tie the hands of that real property in dispute resolution, and that may be something else that we would look at as another resolution to this conundrum.
Okay.
I had Mr. Tully, you've spoken once, and you've spoken, yeah, Mr. Pond, please.
Well, thank you. I want to reiterate something that's already been said, but I just want to reiterate it. By the way, I'm happy to move forward with this, happy to move forward as quickly as possible. I don't know exactly what that means because there are a lot of questions. I don't agree with all the recitals. I don't want to see them that way. I don't know how we're going to see the review, so somehow that's going to have to be part of this. I'm curious, and I'm glad that you're going to talk to Lakewood because, frankly, I am a little bit concerned with the timeframes that are articulated and the noticing requirements, including copying and all those other things. To me, it seems like it'd be really nice to know whether or not this has ever been called upon, how it's worked or how it hasn't worked. Again, I think you put it correctly. Would they change something now, perhaps that they had written down previously? I'd like to know that because I do think that I'm suspicious that some of those noticing and some of those timelines, don't seem like a great deal, and sometimes I'm not sure to which party. I mean, but it seems very tight. There is one other thing I think that should be discussed, and that's applicability, which in their ordinance says it's applicable to any construction commenced after the ordinance is effective. Its effective date. I'd like to talk about that. We've got a number of communities I do believe are going to have HOAs that are under construction currently, right now, although perhaps not fully developed. Maybe they just have one of the model homes up, but there's a community that's about to be developed. I just want to know whether or not we would, how do we feel about that? Do we, or is it possible for the applicability to be something retrofitted to some projects that are actually underway.
Well, isn't this just for condos? It's not for single family. Is that true?
Yeah, this is, at least in Lakewood and in the state statute, restricted to attached dwellings would, read, duplexes, fourplex, or multifamily.
multifamily owner occupied.
I mean, it'd be a
Not
question
s-
whether or not we have any of that product out there. We do, we might, so
Okay.
Let me say that I have been in full support of the House bill that failed, went down there and testified, might not, but stood in backing up of it. I do think that we have to be aware that there are many cities who are not going to do this sort of an ordinance. And we want to be fair to both our builders as well as potential homeowners. So I think we need to look at it carefully before we kind of go diving in. You wanted to speak again?
Well, I understand the concerns, but this has been debated at the Capitol for 5 months, and Lakewood has implemented this. I respect Lakewood's movement on it. I think that we should bring this forward with some minor changes for the timing. If 14 days is too short of a time, do you have a suggestion? 21 days, 30 days? I mean, I don't see why we have to have another debate on that. I mean, we could have a debate on the dais about it if we decide to move it forward on an emergency ordinance too, but what would be a more acceptable time frame? 30 days?
Yeah, on the timing, I think 30 days would be more appropriate than 14 days. You know, in a defect, they define a defect in here as not conforming to the applicable sections of the building code or does not conform to the manufacturer's specifications if those specifications are more strict than the application's provisions of the building code. So, you know, is that really the standard of defect? I mean, is that an appropriate standard of defect?
I'm suspecting that, and I noticed that as well, I'm suspecting that mirrors what you'll see likely in the complaint. You know, if I'm an attorney for the homeowner and there's some leaking or whatever, I'm gonna allege not only inconsistent with the building permit, but if there were built facilities that are incorporated in that were made somewhere else, so I'm gonna also allege, you know, not constructed according to that manufacturer's specifications to be able to cast the widest net, you know, putting on a sort of plaintiff's hat. I think that's why that's in there. The city can certainly choose to decide what kinds of claims are going to be in the scope of this case and what aren't. One way to narrow it slightly is to restrict it to the city's building code. And say those are the claims that we're gonna, what probably happens in practice, and if the goal is to, you know, I won't say eliminate these suits, but to eliminate the threat of them, then I think you almost have to take the broader view, because if you only take the building code claims, you're gonna have others. As a plaintiff's attorney, I'm gonna go, okay, I can't bring that claim, but I can bring this one. And then you're still there. So I think if you're sort of in all the way or not, as far as that's concerned.
See, I really think, Bud, that if we took some of your suggestions about the 30 days, and then if Mr. Dahl contacted Lakewood's attorney and said, okay, what would you have done differently? Do we have to add any specific things for Wheat Ridge? And then we bring it back in as an ordinance. It's still first, you know, if it's an emergency, it'll pass that night, but we still have that 90 days to work with it if we have to make any changes. So I would rather see it come forward sooner than later.
Mr. Urban?
I guess I would caution against trying to tailor this situation too closely to any sort of perceived needs for Wheat Ridge. I think the timing issue is something that could be modified in some way, and I think that is a bit of an onerous timeline. However, as we look across the landscape and you see ordinance after ordinance from different municipalities coming up and being different in different ways, it reduces the impact of its effect on insurance companies and others looking and saying, well, how different is this from the Lakewood ordinance? And one thing I guess I would ask of the mayor is that we work very closely with the Metro Mayor's Caucus and any guidance that they provide relative to how this can be done. I know Lone Tree and some other municipalities have also taken this under consideration or are currently considering it. So I would like it to be as close to those other municipalities' ordinances as possible, just because it would give us the greatest likelihood of success if everybody is similar in this vein. But understanding Wheat Ridge is Wheat Ridge, and we needed to do what's best for us, but I'd caution against changing it too much, because then we lose the impact that we'd have if everybody has similar ones lined up next to each other. Thank you.
Anyone else wish to speak?
Does anybody have a problem with the consensus, or do you want to not have a consensus tonight?
Before you do that, can I ask a couple questions? The first would be Chapter 26 amendment or not. And that, as you well know, affects whether it's going to the Planning Commission, longer review. You've got a couple choices there. You certainly could set up the emergency ordinance as a Chapter 11 ordinance, and then you don't even have the provision. Well, I think it's probably, if you're going to do an emergency, probably doesn't matter. But in any event, the real question is, how do you set up the permanent ordinance? You set that up as a Chapter 26 ordinance, or and then you go through the full Planning Commission review, which would mean also any amendments to it in future would go through that review. I'm not saying you should or shouldn't. I just want you to be thinking about the implications of that. I will also say that if you add plat note requirements, those are found in our Chapter 26, which is the right place for them. It's where we put all the required plat notes on subdivision plats. So if you have that in the ordinance, that will trigger that review. I suppose you could carve that off as a separate ordinance too, if you liked. Sorry to complicate your lives a little, but these are the practical considerations that I'll have to know about as I'm writing it and bringing it to you.
Mr. Fitzgerald?
I think it's pretty obvious that we're going to pass this one way or another, but I don't think it's a problem if we take a couple more weeks to look at this. I don't, anybody who's interested, any builder who's interested is going to see that it's going to happen. But I think we should look at some of these issues, and I'm particularly still worried about the minority that is going to be left out in the cold.
Well, based on what Mr. Starker said earlier about more public input, I think it should go in Chapter 26. That will give the Planning Commission the ability to have a hearing and comment on it. So I still think it should be an emergency to bring it forth to show we're serious about it, and show the community and the development community that we're taking it seriously. But I think if we go through the 90 days, if it goes to the Planning Commission and City Council, that's one more touch and feel by another group of people. I think Chapter 26 would make sense to me in the final form.
So to make it easy for the emergency, you could just adopt what's Lakewood is, because then you could figure out all these other issues when you actually adopt it after that.
Because I think that with the whole point of this on the minority, you want it fixed unless someone really wants to sue just to make money. But if the requirement is that you have to contact the builder and ask them to remedy it, that's the lawsuit is the last piece. Where right now it's the first piece, and that's where I think we have to protect everybody. Because I think if I lived in a condo, I wouldn't want someone just messing with stuff so they could sue, and tie up my property. I'd like to have the builder fix a real problem before they sued. And I think, and that's why I had a concern about this in the beginning, because the trial lawyers want this to go to court. I'm going to be real honest, the trial lawyers want this to go to court so they can increase their profits, and instead of having the actual problem fixed. So I think we should look at, I don't think the minority's hurting here, really, I don't, based on.
I think we're looking at a point of, do we, go ahead, Mr. Starker, you would.
Well, just to one specific point, I think if we were to go with the plat note strategy, I think that should be a separate ordinance. Okay. Just so that they're different,
Fair enough.
They just seem to be, they feel different to me.
Anyway. I think they are. They're different enough. You can easily do them separately.
Sort of deals.
Yep.
And I guess I probably would defer to my colleague. I'm not sure what the effect of an emergency ordinance is as opposed to the regular track, so.
Timing. No, I could take a shot at a consensus and see if you guys agree.
It's gonna, we're gonna, and I think it's appropriate to put it in Chapter 26 so that we are able to sort of vet the process.
Mr. Pond.
Yeah, before you do this consensus, so that we can just be fully informed on it, if someone can help me understand if I agree, Chapter 26, so if we're saying that it's an emergency ordinance that's going to reside in Chapter 26, What is the timeline? What are the steps? Because I'm hearing a little bit about being able to debate this afterward. I do want more time with this. Happy to take that on the dais and handle it on the dais. I have no problem with that, but I don't know if that's happening sooner or later or what. So I just want to know kind of what's the pathway.
Mr. Dahl?
Well, emergency ordinance is only good for 90 days.
Yeah,
So
that's right.
Mr. Dahl can speak to that.
So during that 90-day period, you ramp up the main ordinance, then you have, in that time frame, the opportunity to go to the planning commission.
So,
With the regular
so
ordinance.
potentially, the conversations with Lakewood, the time before the planning commission, our ability to talk about it either in study session and/or on the dais at a regular business meeting will happen inside of that 90 days.
Yes.
Good. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. There's time for that. Meanwhile, you have a 30-day ordinance that would not have gone to planning commission. I say a 30. You'll have an immediate ordinance. As soon as I can get it on your agenda, which brings me to the next question, which is, when is that? Is that a month or a week from tonight, or is it 3 weeks from
Well, if you do an emergency and if you just adopt Lakewoods, we could turn it around and get it on next Monday, probably.
Yeah, it's just word processing, and I can
Well,
get that
30
done.
days, 30 days notice, if you do Lakewoods, the number, 30 days notice?
We're talking about.
No, I would say not, because
Yeah.
because all of
That's
that
what I'm hearing.
all of that discussion would ensue. The act of adopting Lakewoods is just to get the ordinance in place. Then you actually start to reconstruct and tinker with it. So I would not change the 30 days now.
I think that's what I'm hearing. If I don't want to put words in your mouth, I think that's what I'm hearing from Councilmember Starker, that while he has concerns about the 15-day periods and the other requirements and well, you should probably express yourself that's for another day, which is for the regular ordinance debate process. But if that's what you were saying.
All right, if I understand this correctly.
But
Go ahead.
if by making it an emergency ordinance, we're going to make an ordinance and sort of run it through before we have time to sort of understand what the ordinance is going to mean, I would not be in favor of that. I think we owe it to sort of ourselves not to have sort of two ordinances going, if you will. I mean, I think we can sort of make the decision that we want to discuss this and make good law for Wheat Ridge, and go and make good law for Wheat Ridge, and we can vet it through the Planning Commission, and we can have the public hearings. I for one don't think we need to enact an emergency and ordinance until we can get that done.
Ms. Davis, you wanted to comment?
So that was just kind of my point. I just, I think there's a lot of I don't want to say issues, but there's a lot of things to discuss about this. Obviously, it raised concerns because it didn't pass, but I think it's something we need to study. We need to make good law. I know, Mr. DiTullio referred to a developer on Upham, but I know that developer is also has been working with Wheat Ridge, so I don't feel like we'd be chasing that person off if we respectfully went through this process. Patrick, is there some time situation with the Upham development, or is it, can we go through this process and kind of vet out some of our questions, maybe have some learnings from Lakewood? And I just, I sort of have visions of marijuana here, that it's like, there's going to be some days that if we do this without some thoughtful discussions and maybe learning from our neighbors and et cetera, that someone might come up and say, you and Lakewood are the only people who did this, and now look at me, So I just want to make sure that we are all very informed on some of these things that we're doing. And I guess I guess even if there was maybe a rush for it, is that still the right thing to do?
Mr. DiTullio?
So here's what we could also do, time-wise. We could say tonight, make some of the changes that's been suggested, like the 30 days, add a recital or two if you want to keep it, and then send this to the Planning Commission as soon as possible. Make it part of Chapter 26, let the Planning Commission vet it, and then it'll come to council for first and second reading. And at that time, like any other ordinance, it's just that I just don't want it to sit For me personally, I don't want it to sit for 9 months before it gets to planning commission. So if we could get it to planning commission with some of the changes that you've suggested tonight, gets vetted at planning commission, then they make a recommendation that comes to council, in a expedient amount of time, I think that's gonna solve the same problem. But it's still maybe that 60 days. Would that make sense? To make some of the changes tonight, then send that ordinance on to planning commission?
Sure.
And I think that's fine too, but I think then when will the planning commission have discussion about Lakewood's learnings? If there were some learnings, what would you add? What would you take away?
Have all that go into planning commission.
I'll put that in the staff report. I'll make the calls, and then there'll be a staff report that gives you what more I can learn.
All right, so I'm really hearing a lot of division as far as whether to make an emergency ordinance right now or work with it a little bit longer and do this down the road, a little bit down the road. Mr. Starper.
I'd like to make a consensus that we direct the city attorney to take the discussion that we've had based on the Lakewood ordinance and the plat note idea also. Consult with his colleagues in Lakewood and make whatever other changes that he thinks is appropriate to the ordinance. I actually would like to see it come back to a study session here so that we could vet it one more time, make any changes that we have at that time, and then send that revision to the planning commission and let it go through that process.
Could I add to that consensus that have Mr. Doff?
And I think we can make, to keep the pressure on, I think we'll say let's continue to keep this high on our list of things to get done.
Well, would you be willing to put it on at the next study session? In 2 weeks?
I'll be happy to do it as soon as our council can bring the
That's 2 weeks.
draft back to us. Yes,
2
sir.
weeks, okay.
I can be ready to be here again in 2 weeks with the draft.
I think
We're good. Could we also ask, I started saying Mr. Goff, to check with some of the other cities what their thinking is as far as, so give us some opinion as to, because there are other cities that are adapting ordinances as well as those that are not. And I think it might be helpful in our discussion to know what those reasons are.
Yes, why and why not?
Why and why not?
But the consensus is to bring back an ordinance, right, Mr. Dahl? You're going to have something written for
Yes,
council in 2 weeks.
I'm clear with that. And there's 2 weeks, and there's no, when you put together a staff report, it's, whether you told me to or not, I'd probably do an attorney's listserv, to get out to more than just Lakewood, find out what other people have done.
So with the recommendations of tonight, it would be in chapter 26, and then it would also have a 30-day window versus the 14, those types of things we can put in there now. And separate the plat. And then if I don't know, I have to agree with Mr. Pond. I think the recital about safe housing, I think it should be in there. I think just one more reason why to have it. I mean, I don't know. Do you want to keep that recital in there about fair and safe housing?
No, I was looking at a different recital.
Health, safety, that one.
Yeah, no, I don't think that, I mean, we can talk about it. I'm not sure.
Well, since that's what a study session is for, if you're going to, I think I've got a sense of what to bring back, and it'll be 90% there, and then your job will be to do the last 10%.
Yeah, that's right. I'll talk about it at the next time.
Isn't the health and safety clause in almost every ordinance we have?
Yeah, it's.
So why ask? So if it's necessary, if it's not necessary, then I don't want it.
Yeah, it's
Starker,
inoffensive.
Mr. Dahl, I assume that when we pass this ordinance, then we're sort of trumping state law that talks about these things?
That's right. I mean, we're home rule, and that's the card Lakewood is playing. I think it's possible. I think they're just making certain that they lay that marker down. And the home rule litigation sometimes favors home rule cities and sometimes it doesn't, as you know. And I think it's a pretty good, strong argument here. But the Supreme Court over the last 10 years has not been really as fully supportive of home rule authority in the land use arena as it had been in the prior few decades. Generally, home rule cities still win, but, and not to lengthen the discussion, but the example would be the Commerce City photo radar case, where there was a statute, I forget on what aspect of photo radar. Commerce City said, well, you know, that's regulating traffic. Traffic is a purely local concern, and that wasn't quite good enough for the Supreme Court, so that came as kind of a surprise. They turned right around and upheld Telluride's condemnation of the valley floor for open space way outside the town, and easily supported that. So on balance, they're still with Article 20, the home rule, but there are some cracks, we'll see.
Madam Mayor.
Mr. Urban?
One thing that I don't know if we got a consensus on was providing some sort of sunset provision in this ordinance relative to a comparable state law or some other state action that comports with what we're trying to do here. I don't want to necessarily say anything that comes up at the state level we'll bow to, but something that says if a
Review of
something,
ordinance.
I'm not sure how to word that, but a sunset provision of some kind.
If it's, if the,
If
something passes
if a
statewide.
substantially similar,
So that we're not sitting out there with this odd ordinance where everybody else is doing something else.
Is that considered a part of the consensus or not? Because you haven't voted yet. on
I
the
just have a,
consensus.
I have a
We
quick
did.
question on that issue. If the state does do something, does state law automatically trump a city ordinance?
No.
It
no,
doesn't? Oh.
Again, when you're a home rule municipality, if it's a matter of local concern, you win always. If it's, yeah, unless it's the Constitution, but if this isn't. So if it's a matter of local concern, the city law would continue to apply. There's a middle ground where it's a matter of mixed state and local concern, which is frankly more likely for the court to come down on here. And in that arena, the court has to uphold the city ordinance so long as it can allow the city and the state ordinance or state law to both coexist.
Yeah, I support the sunset discussion that we look at that if the state does something. I was just curious how that worked.
I think Mr. Starker.
I don't object to that. And the only thing it sounds complicating to me is that we write into statute, into our ordinance, some hypothetical, and then how do you frame what the state legislation is going to look like so that your hypothetical termination of this ordinance kicks in? And I wonder if we might not be, from a practical point of view, better off to make our law the way that we feel it should be fashioned for our city, and then at some time in the future, if a future council and a future legislature makes other law that makes this law non-desirable to our citizens in our city, that the council at that time would address it and move to repeal it.
well,
Just from a sort of a practical point of view.
I'd like to at least just give Jared a crack at making it work and seeing what we can do.
You know, and
So-
Are you adding that the council assent to review at that, if the state passes the law? Or are you saying that it will just automatically?
It depends on what our city attorney can come up with respect to some type of sunsetting mechanism that doesn't put this in a situation where we have contradictory city law to state law. If something so if we have a state law around construction defects and we have a city law around construction defects, and there, some. Well, sure, but just.
I think what Mr. Fitzgerald said would be assent to review. So in other words, that we would put something in ours that if a state law comes forward, that we would then review ours. Would that work for you?
Review it.
We would review it, right.
I think that that's one sunset strategy that can be provided for. I'm not sure what some of the alternative ways to do that might be. I don't necessarily disagreeing with that, but I want to leave it kind of open, some type of sunsetting mechanism that allows it to go away.
I'm okay with
Then I would add that to the consensus that we had before, that if we could look at some sort of a sunset type provision.
Okay. Sure, I can do that. Did we vote on that?
Yeah.
Consensus,
I
we
do
did,
need a
okay.
vote. We did on the first one, so this is
We did a consensus.
right. Okay. Right. We like this one. We don't want to let it go, do we? I believe that concludes that discussion. We're at the end of the meeting. I need to know if there's any elected official report. Can I have the floor, please? Where's my hammer? Thank you. We're going to move on to elected official reports.
I just want to remind everyone that this Saturday is the 44th Avenue Cruise, and it'll be going on pretty much most of the day along 44th Avenue from Harlan all the way down to Ward Road. Probably the majority of the traffic will be between 11 and 3 o'clock, and the cruise will be ending at Anderson Park starting around 2 to 3 for the judging of the vehicles. And there will be additional police officers along 44th that day, but to definitely expect more traffic, but there'll be really cool cars on 44th Avenue this coming Saturday.
Is there a place where some of those will be parking as well? So if a person wanted to just wander around and look at them?
I would say either at Cipher Automotive, which is off of 44th and Harlan.
Okay.
There will be over 250 cars there in the beginning, and then they'll be cruising down 44th, and then at the end at Anderson Park.
Okay, so either location. Toward the end, there'll be more at Anderson Park. They'll move
Right,
from
or you
Cipher.
could, and then along some businesses along 44th are sponsor stops along the way. So in fact, if you just want to park a lawn chair on 44th, you'll probably see a lot. Yeah, so.
Ms. Davis.
I just want to remind all the folks that my second outreach meeting is this Thursday at Colorado Plus, and everyone's welcome. And it's from 6 to 7.
This Thursday,
This
6 to
Thursday.
7, Colorado Plus. Thank you. Mr. Starker, anything?
I don't think I have anything tonight, thank you.
Mr. Fitzgerald.
Just to let people know, there is a meeting tomorrow night that will discuss maker districts, and that is something that is potentially applicable to our Ward Road station. So if anybody wants information, they can.
What was the word, maker district?
Maker districts.
Meaning?
Make. I'm going to make you a cake.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
It's where you get together people who are craftsmen all together.
All right, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Mr. DiTullio, do you have anything for us?
So Genevieve, as a judge, what time did you want me to be at the site, at Cipher or at the park? Or will you let me know?
Tomorrow night is our last meeting, and Troy Cipher will let you know. I believe it's 2 o'clock, but probably earlier.
So what we were talking about is there's going to be a cluster of cars at Cipher in the morning, and then they're going to do the poker run, which is they go to a business, they get one poker card, and then they're going to end up eventually at Anderson Park in the back, and that's where those 2 car shows will basically be, one at Cipher and one at the back of the park. So it'll be fun. In the front? Oh, okay. It's in the front.
In the front.
Thanks.
And just to add to that, the Wheat Ridge STEM engineering team is going to have their international winning car on display, so at Anderson Park.
You know, it'll be at Anderson.
That's what I understand. So it'll be the first opportunity to see the car since the competition. So.
And Mr. Pond? Our manager? Nothing? Okay, as far as I'm concerned, that concludes.
Does the clerk have anything?
Oh, the clerk. I always forget the clerk. You guys.
I don't have anything tonight.